My name's Craig Abbott. I'm the head of accessibility over here in DWP Digital, and today we're looking at accessibility and automated testing. The caveat, I guess, to start with is that the term automated can mean different things to different people. The majority of this talk is around automated browser tools. They're not technically fully automated because you've got to kind of run them against every page. So you can't automate an entire website with these tools, or at least not the ones I'm going to show. You do have to run them on every page. So some people will say they're not fully automated. But at the end, if there's time, I'm going to try and live code a couple of fully automated acceptance tests, which will show you how you can kind of build it into a test suite so it is fully automated. So I guess start off by asking, why is automated testing important? There's 50 criteria that we need to meet in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG 2.1. Testing against all of them is really time consuming. Using automated tools can help us to find common errors in a matter of seconds. So we use automated tools just to find really obvious mistakes very quickly, rather than wasting loads of time manually testing further down the line and finding that we've got a load of problems. Automated tools will not find everything. In an audit done by GDS, or Government Digital Service, they identified that when used in isolation, the paid tools perform better than the free ones, and the best tools only find around 40% of 142 known issues. But if you combine the free tools, you can get to around 40% using a few of the free ones. So if you buy, I think it was SortSite that tops the list, you've got to pay for a subscription, but that will find around 40% of errors on its own. We use Arc Toolkit, Axe DevTools, and Wave, and combine these find around 40% of issues. They will find a lot of the same errors, but each tool's kind of got its own little areas of expertise. So each tool will find some things that the other tools won't, which is why we use all three. So it does seem a bit repetitive sometimes. You keep finding the same errors in all three tools, but it's worth running all three because they don't find all of the same things. The 142 known issues that I talked about before, it's been nicknamed the world's least accessible web page. They basically built a page, they put 142 issues on it on purpose, and then they threw all the automated tools at it to see what kind of things that they could find. So whenever I come across a new automated tool, I do just use that page as a benchmark just to try and see what them automated tools can find. This is the web page. It's broken down into sections, and it's got 142 different accessibility issues on it. So for example, a language attribute has not been used to identify a change of language, and then they've deliberately coded something in where they've got a different language in there and there's no language attribute. So there's a bunch of issues on there. And then if you want to test how good an automated tool is, say we wanted to test how good Accessibility Insights was with the automated tool, we can just throw it at that page and then kind of see what comes back. But we'll look at that in a bit more detail in a second. So in this talk, I'm going to try and cover HTML validation using the W3C markup validation service. And I'm going to show you how to use HTML validator, the command line tool, so you don't have to necessarily keep going into the web browser and pasting your code in. I'm also going to show you how to use browser tools like Axe, Arc, and Wave, and how to interpret the results against WCAG 2.1. Then at the end, hopefully I will write some code that works, and we'll have a look at how you can fully automate HTML validator, Axe Core, and there's some automated software called Pally, which you can run Axe Core through as well. I'll show you how to do that. So the first step of any automated testing is to validate your HTML. It's always the first step in the testing process. With accessibility, if your HTML is not valid, then it's more likely to have accessibility issues as well. There's a massive knock-on effect. The way the browser interprets the HTML informs the accessibility tree, and then the assistive technology reads the accessibility tree. So if your HTML is not valid, then there's no guarantee that what's in the accessibility tree is going to be correct. The first thing you can use, which is quite user-friendly, is the W3C markup validation service. So this is just an online digital service which can validate your HTML against the HTML5 spec. You can provide a URL, you can upload a file, or you can just key your HTML in directly. So I've made a deliberate invalid HTML file, which looks like, it just looks like a really simple web page. But when you run it through the W3C validator, you should get an error to say that the doc type is missing, and you should also get an error to say that this paragraph here, the second paragraph down, it should also pick up that it's using an invalid attribute. So if we go to the W3 markup validation service, we've got validate by URL. So you could literally, if it's online, you can just chuck the URL in there and it'll do it for you. You can validate by file input. So if you have a HTML file, then you can upload the HTML file into here. So we could do it that way because this is a HTML file. But most of the time when we're working on local websites, they are using a server, and you can't, it'll be using template and languages which aren't HTML and stuff. So normally I just paste it in. So it'll just be a case of opening up in a code editor, copying all the HTML, and then dumping that into that field. And then when you click check, you will get some results. So what it should do is the same as, yeah, so it has done what I thought it would do. It says that the start tag was seen without seeing a doc type. It expects to see doc type HTML at the top of the page. And it said that attribute moo is not allowed on a paragraph element at this point, and that's because it had an attribute of moo equals cow. It'll then tell you what you can do to fix it if it knows. So for example, because I've used an invalid attribute, it's going to point me to the global attributes in the HTML spec. So if I click on this, it'll tell us what I can use for a paragraph tag. And these are all of the attributes that I can put on a paragraph. Moo isn't in the list, therefore I can't use it. You can get false positives. So no automated tool is perfect. If you get a fail, there's a small possibility that your code is not the problem. 9 times out of 10, it's going to be your code, but sometimes it's not. And if you think it's wrong, study the specifications. And if you think it's wrong, raise a bug with the people that make the validator. So a good example of this, which I found the other day, or I think it's a good example, my code might actually be wrong, but I don't think it is. So I've raised a bug, but I'll show you that now. So if we go back to the HTML validation, markup validation service, if we do it by URL this time, and you paste my blog URL in, when we check this, it goes off to the website, it checks it, and then it gives some errors. So an error is something that it definitely found that was wrong. A warning is something where you maybe, it thinks that there's a problem, but it's not that bad. So in this case, it's saying the banner role is unnecessary on element header. So I could delete role banner there and it'll still work in modern browsers. It might not work in something like Internet Explorer 6 or 8, but it's going to work in modern browsers. Therefore, I might not necessarily need this. But for the errors, it's saying attribute media is not allowed on a meta tag at this point. But then it lists the elements that you can use on a meta tag, and media is actually listed. And if we go into the HTML spec for meta, then it will tell us what attributes we can use, and media is listed as an attribute. So I think that's a bug. It's telling me that I can't use media and then saying that I need to use one of the following, and media's in there. So I've went ahead and I've raised a bug against that. So if you go to github.com and you go to the validator, I've actually raised an issue and I've asked the question, I think this is wrong. This is my reasons why. And then hopefully somebody will pick that up and they might add it to the validator, and therefore it'll stop picking it up as an error in the future so other people won't get the same problem. So the second way to validate your HTML, which is the way that I prefer to do it, just because I can't be bothered to keep putting the URL in and going and doing all of that stuff. You can install HTML validator onto your development machine. So it is a command line tool. The validator itself is a package which you can use in automated test suite, but there is a command line interface for it, and you can kind of run that from your terminal. It uses the same validating engine as the W3C markup service that we've just looked at, but it saves you having to keep going and doing it via the website. So there's a couple of different ways you can do it. Again, I'm going to use the same invalid HTML demo that I just showed, but we're going to do it through the terminal this time. So if I open a terminal up, so in the directory where I'm at now, I've navigated to the directory where the file is, and it's this one that I want to look at, which is invalid.html. Using the commands that validator provides, I can type in HTML validator, and then I can do file equals invalid.html. And in theory, that should work, which it has. It's came back and it said page is not valid. That's not very helpful. So one of the things you can do is you can pass in an option called verbose, and that'll give you a full readout. So you can do HTML validator. I can then add the flag for verbose. And then this time when I get a readout, it's going to tell me what's wrong with it. So it's saying the start tag was seen without saying the doc type first, which is the same as what we've seen on W3C. Attribute mu is not allowed on an element P at this point. So it's the same errors that we see in W3C. It's just you can run it from the command line. You can also pass in a URL. So you could do HTML validator Craig Abbott .co.uk, and that'll do the same thing. Page is not valid. If we add the verbose tag, we get the same readout that we got before. So it's saying media not allowed on element meta, media not allowed on element meta, then it's got the warnings for. So it's all just the same content. It's just in the terminal rather than having to go to the website. The browser tools that we're going to look at, these are extensions or plugins you can install to give you more functionality. So in these demos, I'm going to be using the Chrome browser, and I've got installed Arc Toolkit, Axe DevTools, and Wave. You can get these from the Chrome Web Store. So if you go into the Chrome Web Store and you search Arc Toolkit, it should just come up, and you can install it from there. So once you've got it installed, one of the things that you might have to do if you're working with local files is by default, when you install a Chrome extension, it doesn't have access to file URLs. So you have to turn it on, in which case it'll run against files. So if you go into any extension that you've got installed, if you click on the little three dots and go to manage extensions, you can then turn on the option to allow access to file URLs. If this is turned off, it'll only work on live URLs, like, if something's actually on the web, like using a http.com.co.uk or whatever. If you wanted to access just HTML files that are on your machine, you do have to turn this on, and that's on all three tools. So once you've got them turned on, then we can start to use them. And interpreting the results can be a little bit tricky because every tool is different. So each tool has its own idea of what is an error, what is an alert, and what is best practice. So for example, Arc Toolkit says that skipping a heading level is a WCAG failure. Axe DevTools just says that it's bad practice. The spoiler, I guess, is that it is a failure. Headings need to be the correct level to pass 1.3.1 inform relationships. So if you've got a skipped heading level, Axe DevTools just going to say, it's bad practice, but actually that is a WCAG failure. So when they find issues, make sure that you kind of understand what it is that it's telling you. Don't just take it for granted. Arc Toolkit reads things in three different ways. So it has errors, it has alerts, and it has best practices. Errors are things that it definitely thinks is a fail. Alerts are things that it's suspicious of, but it's not 100% sure if it's a fail. So you've got to kind of make a decision yourself. And best practice are things that it thinks could be a fail or could be better. This should have said Axe DevTools. I've just realized the typo, so apologies for that. Pretend that says Axe DevTools. Axe DevTools reports everything is an issue. It just has one category, which is issue, but then it's broken down into 5 subcategories. It's got critical, serious, moderate, and minor, and then it has best practices as well. I don't trust the way that they group things. Like what they determine to be a minor error is sometimes, for me, what I consider to be a major error. So again, I wouldn't take them at face value. And finally, Wave reports on errors, contrast errors, and alerts. These are things it thinks definitely fails or errors. Contrast errors, it breaks out separately. So if it's purely to do with color contrast, it falls under a different category. Then it's got alerts, which are things that it's suspicious of again, but not 100% sure if it's a fail. And it also reports on things that it thinks are good about your website. So it'll report on features that it thinks are good to improve user experience, structural elements which help you to assess your headers and things, and it'll tag anywhere you use an ARIA attribute. In all honesty, that can make it a bit noisy, so I tend to turn these off. If I'm trying to analyze the results, I'll turn them off, but again, I'll show you that in a second. So we're going to have a look at the browser tools now. I have this HTML file, which looks like this. So we've got a couple of headings, we've got a picture of a cat, we've got descriptions of what it is we're looking to find, basically. I haven't tried to do it where all of the results are hidden. It tells you what the result should be so that you can kind of follow along. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start by running Axe DevTools against this. So the way that Axe works, once you've got it installed, which I've got it installed here, you right click the page and you go to inspect, or you press F12 to bring up the developer panel. In the developer panel, you've got these tabs along the top. And if you go along to more at the end, you've got Axe DevTools. If you bring up the Axe DevTools panel, you can scan part of the page. To be honest, I just scan all of it all of the time. So you can literally just click scan all of my page, and Axe will then go away and try and find some problems with it. So in these results, it's found 4 things. The results get grouped underneath. So there's one result for each of these problems. It's found one problem for ARIA roles. It's found one problem for contrast. It's found one for images, and it's found one for headings. You can filter these. So if you click on the big 4, you'll just get all 4 of them. If you wanted to just say what is a critical issue, you can click on this tiny little 2 here, which isn't super friendly. Actually, I'll zoom in a little bit. You can click on these numbers to filter them out, in which case I've said only show me the critical things, and it's used ARIA roles must conform to valid values and images must have alt text. If I go into moderate, it's then saying heading level should only increase by 1. I would say that is a pretty serious fail, to be honest. You know, if the headings are all over the place, if you can't see the screen, it gets very confusing. And then they've got a serious one, which is elements must have sufficient color contrast. So I don't agree with the groupings, but you can filter them that way if you want to. Another thing that you can do with Axe is you can highlight the issue. So if you want to know where it is on the page, for example, elements must have sufficient color contrast. If I click the little target button at the side, it'll then highlight on the page which part of it is causing the error. So we can have a look at the image, or we can have a look at the heading that should only increase by 1, or we can have a look at the ARIA roles must conform to valid values. So that's kind of a quick rundown of Axe. You'll see that it didn't find a bunch of things on this page. So it found that the text in this paragraph fails a color contrast ratio. It found that there was missing alt text on this image. It found that there was a skipped heading level. It found that there was one invalid role. So interestingly, Axe has a bug where if you use a role of paragraph on a p tag, it doesn't flag it as an error. It thinks it's fine, when actually that is also an invalid role. But it does find it if you put role equals potato, then it finds it. So it's not without its bugs. Role equals paragraph is an invalid value, and Axe didn't find it. There's bad link text on this page, so we've got a read more link, and we've got a click here to view file link. Axe didn't find either of those. The use of the line break is fine here, but Axe didn't flag it up. We'll see that the other tools might. So that's a quick rundown of Axe. Next, I'm going to refresh the page, and then I'm going to show you Arc. So Arc is accessed the same way as Axe. You open up the dev tools, you go along the panel to the more button, and then you go to Arc Toolkit. And this brings up Arc. There's a big run tests button at the top. That's how you run it. You can tell it to turn off certain things. So if you don't want to see alerts or best practices, you can turn them off. I'll just leave everything on and just see kind of what it finds. So if we click run tests, we then get a breakdown. So it's found a few more things than Axe. Axe only found 4 things. This has found 4 errors. It's found 4 alerts, and it's found 1 thing that it thinks could be done better. The things that it's found are the bad ARIA role. So it's found both of them. So it has found role equals potato, and it's found role equals paragraph. Axe didn't find that one, but Arc has. It's also found the insufficient color contrast. So up here, it's saying that the color contrast is only 2.96 to 1, and for text of that size, it should be 4.5 to 1. It's also found that the image had no alt text on, which Axe did find. And then it's found a couple of other things. So it's found that the heading level was skipped. It's only flagged that as an alert. It hasn't flagged it as a failure. There's no navigation landmark, it's saying. On this page, that's fine because there is no navigation menu. Because it hasn't got a header and it hasn't got a navigation menu, that's totally fine to not have one. But because nearly every web page in the world has a navigation menu, it's finding it weird that there isn't one here, and it's saying maybe you forgot to apply a nav element or a role of nav. So it is useful, but this is something that we can just discard. And the same with the bypass blocks method. So every website should have a skip link. I don't know if you saw the talk the other day where we went over it, but if we go to something like gov.uk and press the tab key, then the first thing on the page is usually a skip link at the top, which allows you to jump over the navigation menus. Arc is saying that I can't find one. There's no way to skip over the heading, but again, we haven't got a header on this page. We don't have a header and we don't have a nav bar. Therefore, again, we can just discard this. It's found that a link contains the word click. So it's found that the link's a bit rubbish, but it hasn't found the fact that this one just says read more. So again, it's done a little bit better than Axe, but it's still not finding everything. And then it's flagged this as best practice, and it's saying, consider whether you need to use a line break here, because sometimes people just put line breaks in to create white space, in which case you shouldn't do that. But in this case, I've used it just to move my name onto the next line down for it to look a bit better. So that's a valid use of a line break, so we can discard that as well. So that's how you use Arc. You can kind of review these in the columns. So if we look down here, they've got different groupings for contrast, images, interactive controls. If it's got a dash, it couldn't find anything related to it. But if it's got obviously ones and whatnot in the column, it tells you how many errors it found under each heading. So that is a quick run through of Arc. And then we've got the last one is Wave. So Wave runs slightly different. It doesn't run from the dev tools. It just runs by clicking the icon you click on the plugin icon and then it fires. So if we click on Wave, it then will add a bunch of stuff to the page telling you some stuff about it. So it's found one error, it's found one contrast error, it's found 3 alerts, it's found 1 feature, 8 structural elements, and 8 ARIA tags. Now, Wave is a little bit more simplistic than the other tools. It's definitely not as advanced, but it still does find some things that the other things don't. So it's pulled out ARIA role equals presentation, it's pulled out ARIA role equals potato, and ARIA role equals paragraph. So it kind of found those elements, but it didn't know that they were mistakes. It just badges them under ARIA. And actually what that means is it thinks that they're a good thing. I mean, it does say how to fix it, and then you've got to kind of check it, but it's just kind of badging these up as no matter what you write in there, if it's an ARIA role, it'll get tagged by Wave as being ARIA, whether it's correct or not. And it expects you to know whether roll potato is valid or not. So this feature for me is a little bit useless. It is just very much for seeing what elements are using ARIA and what aren't. You can just turn them off. So if you don't want to see those, you can just untick those and it'll take them all off the page and clean it up a bit. Structural elements can be useful. So we can see here, this is a H1, we can see this is a H2, then we can see this is a H5. So it has found it as a problem. It's saying that the heading level's been skipped. So in Wave, you can click on any of these icons to scroll to them to find out where they are. It's not that user friendly. Basically, you click on it, it goes to there and it blinks to tell you that that's where it is. I'm not sure how accessible that is, but that's what it does. So in this case, it's saying skipped heading level, and when we click on it, that's where it is. We could have found that using the structural elements because we can see that's a H5 and that's a H2. So these things can be useful, but again, if you want to turn them off just to clean it up, you can do. Then it's got features, so it's saying there's a language tag at the top of the page, which is great. If you don't want to show the good things about the page, you can turn them off as well. So now we've just got errors, contrast errors, and alerts, and that makes it a little bit easier to see where they are. So when I was saying Wave isn't as advanced, it isn't, but it does find some things which the others don't because it's focused more on the user rather than on the technical implementations. Axe is very developer heavy. It's focused on, are you using the correct tags? Are you using the correct attributes? Do you have landmarks on the page? It's not looking at, is the content readable? Is this link suspicious? It doesn't look at those kind of things. Wave is the opposite. It tends not to care about the really technical stuff, but it will try and find some of the stuff that'll actually impact the user. Arc sits somewhere in the middle. So Arc will find a little bit of both, but not everything on either. So It's definitely worth using all three tools, but here we can see that Wave has found 2 suspicious links. So it's saying that we need to check this because read more seems a bit suspicious, and click here to view a file. It's also saying it's suspicious. So Wave did find a bunch of things there, which is good. It did find the color contrast problem, it did find the missing alt text. That is a quick rundown of them 3 tools. Oh, actually, one thing before we go. With Wave as well, there is this panel at the bottom for code, which I find super useful. Once you turn off those things as we did before, if you click the code down here, it'll just bring all of the code up on your site, and then you can go through it and you can have a look at the errors alongside the code as well, which can be quite useful. So in this case, the big red icon for where the color contrast is attached directly to the paragraph tag, which is causing the problem. So sometimes it's a bit easier to spot them in there rather than having to like click on them and have it scroll around the page. One big downside of Wave is that it will find problems with content that's hidden. So if you've put some content in a menu and then slid the menu shut and you can't actually get to it, Wave will still find errors with that. It'll just gray the error out. So it's supposed to be obvious that it's not on the page, but it isn't the most user friendly. There's a couple of bonus browser tools that we sometimes use for testing. One of them is the Accessibility Insights plugin. So in here, this has automated tools as well. This isn't going to run on file URLs, so I'll run it on a blog post instead. If you go into here, you've got FastPass, which are automated tools. If I run this one against the same page, we get a bunch of automated checks, the same as we do on Axarc and Wave. This has found that I can't use a paragraph role of potato, but again, like Axe, it hasn't found that the role of paragraph is not valid on a P element. It's found that the color contrast was wrong on that paragraph, and it's found that the alt text was missing. Hasn't found anything else. So in terms of automated testing, Accessibility Insights isn't great, but where it does excel is it has built-in assessment tools. So this is where you can do a lot more. It'll walk you through kind of all the manual checks. So we've just ran the automated tests, which is fine. But what we can do here is we click on keyboard, it'll then tell us how to test keyboard navigation. So it'll say users must be able to navigate all interactive elements, and then it'll tell you how to test it. So use tab and shift tab to navigate between them. Check for keyboard traps. If you do come across a keyboard trap, use your mouse to get past it and then continue the testing. And what you can do is you can turn the visual helper on, and then you can tab around the page and it'll tell you where the tab's going. We can then go back to that field and we can say that passed. There's only 2 interactive elements and both of them work with the keyboard. Keyboard traps, we didn't have any keyboard traps. And you can kind of go through, it'll walk you through essentially a bunch of manual testing, and it'll compile a list of results at the end, which you can export. So at the moment, 5% of the things that we've tested have passed. Nothing has failed drastically other than the automated tests. And we haven't tested 95% of the other things. But as you work through these and you do passes or fails, it'll build a report up, and then you can export the report. So that's really useful for that. If you've not done much manual testing, that's a really good place to start using that plugin. The other plugin is the broken links checker. So if I go again to my blog and I want to test all the links, rather than like clicking on every single link and then seeing if it actually opened anything up, you can run this automated links checker, and what it'll do is just do that for you. And it's found an error, so I can go and have a look at why that link's broken. It turns out it's because I'm on DWP equipment and they don't let me onto Instagram. That's why it's throwing a 403 forbidden error. So in the real world, this link works, but on DWP equipment, it's broken. So that's a quick way you can check broken links, which is useful. The last thing is the web developer toolbar. So in the web developer toolbar, you've got access to a bunch of different tools. So you can disable different things. So you can disable JavaScript if you want. If you disable JavaScript and refresh the page, you'll see this JavaScript button disappeared. I'm going to have a look into why them links have not changed for the color scheme, because they definitely don't pass contrast ratios now. So I've just found a problem with my blog. That's always useful on these demos, or a bit embarrassing, one of the two. But yeah, if you can disable JavaScript, you can disable CSS if you want. So you can go into CSS and you can turn it off and see what the website looks like without any styles on. You can do a rundown of the kind of structure of the website. So if you click on information and you go down here to view document outline, you can see it's got a heading level 1, a heading level 2, and a heading level 2. In the instance on the page where we deliberately added a H5, it becomes more apparent when something's broken. So if we view the document outline on that, it's going to flag that actually there's a H2 and a H5, and the H3 and the H4 between it are missing. So again, it can become quite a useful tool for finding out some of these issues. It'll also allow you to turn images off. So you might want to turn images off and see what it says. You might want to display the alt text as well for images. So you can display alt attributes. And then when you refresh the page, you can see there isn't a one on this kitten. But if we do it again on my blog, if we display the alt attributes for images, then we can see that for this image here, it says Craig Abbott talking at a conference. And at the one at the top, it says Craig Abbott signature logo. So if you want to quickly just check which images have alt attributes, you can use that as well. Obviously, there wasn't a one on the kitten, which we'll look at in a minute. So fully automated testing, I'm still okay for time, so I'm gonna have a good go at these now. Because browser tools can only run on a page, well, they can only run on one page at a time. So as you've just seen, you'll have to, for every page that you're building, you have to run the tools there and then. Otherwise, you build up a big list of stuff that you've got to manually go through and check. So for that reason, some people don't consider the browser extensions to be automated testing, but you can fully automate it. So the engine which runs the Axe DevTools is also available in a package called Axe Core, and you can use Axe Core to fully automate things in your test suite. I'm not aware of any way that you can fully automate Arc Toolkit or Wave at this point, unless you really sort of dive into the way that you can control a browser. So if you don't use them browser extensions, you don't get access to some of those unique things that they find. So again, if you just run Axe Core in your test suite, you're not going to have found them links which were a bit suspect. You're not going to find the fact that role equals paragraph is invalid because Axe didn't find those things, but it does give you another level of automation, so to speak. The recommended testing process is always to start with testing. And when I say the recommended testing process, this is my recommended testing process. I should probably caveat that. You're welcome to come up with your own, but this is the way that I do it. And that's to test the HTML as valid for the page as you build it. So rather than finishing building a page, signing it off as done, passing it over to QA test, and then QA test finding that the HTML is invalid, and then having to try and shoehorn it into the sprint again, or it comes back round the following sprint to redo. Just as you're building the page and you think you're done, validate the HTML at the end and fix it before you hand it over. Again, the browser tools that we've just shown, Axe, Arc, Wave, run all of those things as you build it. So before you decide that it's done and you hand it over to QA, just quickly run the tools and see what things come back. If they all come back clean, great. If they don't, see if you can fix them there and then. The third thing that I would do, and this might be, once you get into the QA test environment, but you might run it as the developer, is to run the acceptance test against the page, just against that page, but just run those things. If you're in QA and the developer's passed this thing over, the first thing you might want to do is just run the test suite and say, yeah, this has got a bunch of HTML problems on it or whatever. Therefore, there's no point in me going any further, because if I spend a week testing this and then we change the HTML, I've got to spend another week testing it. So we may as well just do it now. The next thing is to manually test the page. So that's something like accessibility insights, which I just showed, or you can come up with your own testing templates or whatnot. Then the fifth step is to manually test the page using assistive technologies. So once all of the steps above it are passing, move on to things like screen readers, voice controllers, and screen magnifiers. And then finally, before you push the code into live, just run the test suite again and just make sure that nothing's crept in. That's kind of the way I would say was a foolproof way of doing it, I guess, but it might not work for everyone. So live coding examples. This might go wrong in spectacular fashion, but I'm going to try and live code 2 acceptance tests to show you how that might work on the front end, but kind of I'm going to run it in a Node.js environment. I don't know, that's just what we use in DWP. You might be running another kind of tech stack, in which case this isn't going to work, but it'll hopefully give you at least an insight into the fact that it can be done. So I'm going to do an example of validating the HTML using HTML validator, and I'm going to run Axe-Core in a headless browser using Pally. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new project. I'm just going to call it live coding demo, and I'm going to open that in VS Code. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to initiate a new Node project. So you'll have to have Node and npm installed to do this, but we don't have time to cover how to do that in this session. So I'll just assume you know how to install Node. So I'm just going to start a new Node project. This will give us a package JSON file, which I can use to install the modules that I'm going to use. So the first thing that I'm going to do, I use Mocha and Chai to write my tests. That's just the test suite that I use. So that's what I'm going to use in the demo, but you can use sort of any test suite you want. So I'm going to go ahead and install Mocha and Chai so that I can write my tests out. And we're going to start with the HTML validator. So I'm going to create a test file for that. So I'm going to create HTML validator JavaScript, and I'm going to set a test command up so that I can run the Mocha suite. So I'm just going to do npm test, and I'm going to set a timeout of 60 seconds because the first time you run Pally, for some reason, it takes a long time. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to use expect from Chai because that's just the way that I write tests. You might not need to use Chai if you use something else, but that's what I use to determine whether my test passes or not. And then I'm going to use validator, which is HTML validator, which I haven't installed. So I need to npm install HTML validator. So now that's installed, I can use it, and I'm going to do that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to describe my test. So I'm going to describe validate HTML, and that's going to be a function. And in there, I'm going to say what it should do to pass. So I'm going to say it should have valid HTML. And that's going to be an asynchronous function because it has to wait for the browser to do stuff. For validator, you need to pass some options in. So I'm going to set that up now. So options, and in the options, you've got to specify a URL. So for now, I'm just going to do it to localhost because I'm going to run the file locally on my machine. But you could do this for anything. You could put in Google or you could put in a blog, anything that's on the internet. I'm just going to run it locally, in which case I need to put is local is true. So most of the time in dev environments, you'll be running the application locally on your machine. It won't be on the internet, in which case you need to specify that it's a local URL, otherwise the test will fail. I'm going to then pass that in and save the outputs as result. So result, it's really hard to type and talk at the same time. So I'm going to await the validator to do its thing whilst passing in those options. And then this result here is what I'm going to use for my test. So I'm going to expect that the result.messages to equal an empty array. So I'll show you why that's result.messages in a minute, but basically it's the way that validator works is when it returns results, it'll return things like the URL that it tested, it'll return the headers, but then the errors and the alerts are reported in an array called messages. So we're calling results.messages and we're just saying we expect it to be empty. If there's nothing in there, then this test should pass. So fingers crossed that works. If I run npm test, we should see, I'll zoom in a little bit. If I run npm test, we should see this test fire. Oh, it's not going to work because I'm not running the local version of the website. So this is just a little server, and the accessibility page that we saw before with the kitten on is the thing that it's going to test, but this just serves it onto localhost. So I just set that running, and then we go to localhost 3000. That was the problem before, is that this wasn't running. So fingers crossed, this should work now. If I run test on that, and it's not working, great. What have I done wrong? So I've required that.
You've set npm test to npm test, Craig.
There we go. That's why. Thank you. Well spotted. So that should have ran Mocha. Very glad about that. Thanks, because I would have had a meltdown there. Right. npm test. There we go. So the test ran. It said that it was validating the HTML. It said it should have valid HTML, and the test failed. And the reason why it failed is because that array wasn't empty. It's actually passed some messages back. And we can see here an image must have an alt attribute, and it's pasted the code in for the image there. It's the image of the cat that we used. It said that you can't have a roll of potato on that paragraph, and it said you can't have a roll of paragraph on that paragraph. So the HTML validator test is running now. That's working fine. So that is how you would run that in a test environment. The next thing to spin up quickly is a test for Pally, which will run Axe. So Pally's got its own automated test runner, which is called HTML/CS, I think. But you can also pass Axe in, so you can use Axe and HTML/CS using the Pally headless browser, and I'll show you that now. So if we do a new test for Pally, which I will need to install, so npm install Pally. What I should be able to do now is I want to use expect again, because that's just the way that I do it. I think you can use assert and not use try, but that's just how I do it. So const Pally equals require Pally. I'm going to describe the test, which is Pally. And I'm going to say it should have no accessibility issues. Again, we'll make it async. And in here, so the Pally is quite simple. You just literally wait for it to run. So you can do results equals await Pally. And then what you've got to do is pass in a URL, which is, in this case, localhost. And that is pretty much it for Pally. That'll run it. And then you've got to expect the results to be empty again. So expect results. This time it's issues. Pally uses results.issues rather than .messages, but it's the same concept. So we're saying we wanted to equal an empty array. Now, in theory, this should run now. I'm going to just run this test so that I don't run the HTML validator again and confuse things. But if I run npm test now, Pally's going to run. It does take a little while the first time for some reason, but once it's done it once, it then runs a bit quicker. But it'll spin up a headless version of Chrome and it'll test the page, and it should give us a failed test. Right, so there we go. So that's ran. So it said it should have no accessibility issues, and it has found an error. It says the image doesn't have an alt attribute, but if we look here, it's got a runner, and the runner that found the problem was HTML/CS. So it isn't using Axe at the moment, it's just using HTML/CS. And what you can do with Pally is you can specify that you want it to use Axe. So you can do runners as an option, which you pass in afterwards. And then in there, you can pass in different runners. So I still want it to run HTML/CS. I don't want to lose that functionality, but I also want it to use Axe. And if I pass Axe in, now it'll run Axe core and Pally's sort of default one. So if I run the test again, should be a bit quicker this time. And this time, still hasn't ran. Wait a minute, what have I done wrong? HTML/CS and Axe. Runners, not runner. That should have been runners, sorry. I've just put in runner. So is this going to work this time? There we go. So now we've got two errors in there, and they're the same error. So we've got Now we've got a color contrast issue, which we didn't have before, but it's also found again that the image doesn't have the correct alt text, but this time the runner that found it was Axe. So you end up with duplicate errors sometimes, but it's better to have more runners than not enough runners. So the more things you can run against it, the more errors you're going to find. So in this case, I'm running HTML, CS and Axe, and I'm finding a bunch of different errors. In theory now, if we go into the live code and demo server and we fix them issues, so we had a color contrast issue. If we just delete the class off that to make it not have a color contrast issue, if we add alt text to this image, which is a sleeping kitten, it's so fluffy. So we've got alt text on that now. We get rid of these funky role equals potato, and we get rid of this role equals paragraph. And hopefully that should then, so this is something to note, is we know there's still more than them accessibility issues on this page. We know that for sure because we found them with the other tools. But for the purposes of this automated test, if I run both the HTML validator and Pally now, we should have a bunch of passing tests. So it's tested the HTML, it said everything's valid, and it's used Pally and ran Axe against it, and it says it's now got no accessibility issues. We know there are some in there, but this is an example of how you can very quickly find, in your test suite, you can automate a whole bunch of stuff.
Hi, Craig. Thank you for that. That was really good. So moving on from the DAC3 that we used to have, that teams used to use for the WCAG criterion checks, and the new top 10 checklist that you created. So was that top 10 checklist based on the things the automated tools found?
No, so the top 10 basic checks were just the things that we obviously found really were quite common failures and big barriers. If you pass the basic accessibility checks, it won't guarantee that it's compliant, but it'll mean that there's no really big barriers for people. It won't include things like language attributes and things, but we know that they, in the real world, don't really cause that many issues for people for the most part. I mean, unless you speak two languages and you've got a screen reader and you happen to have your operating system and your screen reader set to different things, then it'll cause a problem for you, but they're quite niche scenarios. So those wouldn't be covered. It could still be non-compliant in the eyes of the law, but in terms of it being usable, it should be usable with the basic checks. But yeah, you can use Accessibility Insight should tell you whether it's fully compliant or not. If you use something like the DAC3, again, if you get it right when you follow it, then it should tell you that it's fully compliant. The basic checks is missing a few things, but in the future, we'll take the basic checks and the DAC3 and make something better. The DAC3 is a bit clunky and we're in desperate need of updating it. So we'll look at updating that in the coming months.
So the second question or comment is from Michael and our team. So would you expect project teams to also include keyboard testing? And at what point of accessibility testing process include the manual WCAG checks or the manual assistive technology testing?
So keyboard testing is covered in the manual part of it. In all honesty, if I was the front end developer on a team, I would have tested the keyboard before I passed it over. If it gets to QA and you've not been through with the keyboard, I would be very surprised. I would imagine developers, fill it in with the keyboard as they're going, but maybe I'm making incorrect assumptions. I would test it before I handed it over, but it will get picked up as part of their manual test. So we saw in Accessibility Insights, it says everything's going to work with the keyboard, and it showed you where the tab focus was going. In the DAC3, if you use that, it'll say, make sure everything works with the keyboard. It is part of the manual testing, so it will get picked up. But I think it's a good point. Personally, I would do it as part of building the page. It's inefficient not to do that, because then, if the QA tester literally hits tab 3 times and finds a problem, then they've got to pass it back to dev, and the whole thing just becomes a bit more labor intensive.
Can I just say a huge thank you to Craig? It has been so interesting. This whole week has been really, he's shared a wealth of resources and skills and knowledge that I'm sure we will all benefit from. So thank you to Craig for doing that. Thank you to those of you who have given up your time to attend this session. If you've managed to attend every session this week, like an extra big thank you and well done. I would encourage you to keep thinking about, like, going back to what your takeaways were from it, and remember to put these things into action, because it's only actually of any use if we do it. But thank you so much for your time. I realise time is precious.